Central Park, NYC, 1856, the year the city decided. Black screen, the faint sound of wind through trees, then horse hooves on dirt, a distant church bell, fade in slowly, narrator low, deliberate, before the lawns, before the lakes, before the carriage drives and violinists beneath elm trees. There was a map, and in 1856 New York City drew a line through living rooms. Cut to a slow aerial shot of present-day Central Park at dawn, mist rising from the water. This is the story of the year Central Park was not yet beautiful, the year it was inevitable. Because long before the famous designers, long before the romantic paintings and postcards, there was a decision, and once the city made it, there was no turning back. A city on the edge, 1856. By 1856, New York City was choking on its own momentum. The harbor never slept. Ships pressed into its waters from Liverpool, Hamburg, Havana. Masts formed a forest against the skyline. Cargo moved in waves: cotton, timber, sugar, machinery, and with every arriving vessel came people. Immigrants stepped onto the docks by the thousands, Irish fleeing famine, Germans escaping upheaval, families carrying everything they owned in trunks and cloth bundles. They poured into lower Manhattan, where brick tenements rose quickly and cheaply, stacked floor upon floor, window against window. The city expanded upward before it expanded outward. Tenements multiplied like brick forests with no air between them. Laundry lines crossed narrow courtyards. Children played in alleyways barely wide enough for sunlight. The smell of horses, refuse, sweat, and coal smoke blended into a permanent atmosphere. Industry roared, factories clanged, steam hissed, carriages rattled over cobblestone. Manhattan pulsed with energy and exhaustion at once. The wealthy retreated north, building townhouses farther from the docks and the chaos. The poor crowded south, pressed into neighborhoods where 5 families might share what once held one. Summer heat trapped itself between buildings like a sealed furnace. Without open land to breathe, the air thickened. Disease spread easily: cholera, typhus carried by poor sanitation and stagnant water. Newspapers began comparing New York unfavorably to European capitals. Look at Paris, they said. Look at London. Cities with grand parks, wide promenades, landscaped breathing spaces where citizens of every class could walk beneath trees and escape the suffocation of industry. New York wanted dignity. It wanted prestige. It wanted proof that it wasn't merely a chaotic port city scrambling for profit. It was a civilization worthy of the modern world. And so the idea hardened: a vast public park. Not at the edge of the city where only the wealthy would benefit, not hidden along the waterfront, but carved directly into Manhattan itself, between 59th and 106th Streets. At the time, that stretch of land felt distant from the dense southern neighborhoods. It was rocky, uneven, wild. Swamps dotted its lowlands. Outcrops of Manhattan schist broke through soil. Goats grazed in open patches. Small farms and settlements scattered across the terrain. Perfect, some planners said. Empty, others claimed. But it was not empty. Families lived there, many of them poor, many of them black landowners in communities like Seneca Village. Churches stood, schools operated, lives unfolded in modest homes that would soon be labeled obstacles to progress. The debate over a park was not only about trees and lawns. It was about power, about whose vision of the city would prevail. New York stood on the edge, overcrowded, ambitious, desperate to redefine itself before it collapsed beneath its own growth. The question was no longer whether the city needed space to breathe. It was what it would sacrifice to get it. The land that wasn't empty before surveyors walked Manhattan with measuring chains, before commissioners debated symmetry and scenery, before the words "great public park" hardened into official decree. There were people. There were farmers turning rocky soil with steady hands. There were modest wooden homes with vegetable gardens pressed against uneven ground. There were laundry lines fluttering between fences. There were churches where hymns rose over wind-swept hills. There were schools teaching children to read beneath low ceilings. There were gravestones marking memory. One of those communities was Seneca Village. It stood roughly between what is now 82nd and 89th Streets on the west side of the future Central Park. It was not wealthy, it was not architecturally grand, but it possessed something rare, especially for mid-19th century America. Many of its black residents owned their land. In 1856, that meant something radical. Property ownership in New York State was directly tied to voting rights for black men. To own land was not merely to possess soil, it was to possess political voice. It meant stability in a society structured to deny it. It meant roots in a city where mobility was often forced rather than chosen. It meant permanence, and permanence can be inconvenient when a city decides to reinvent itself. Seneca Village was one of the largest communities of black property owners in New York at the time. Irish immigrants lived alongside them. Churches like the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church stood as pillars of spiritual and civic life. Schools operated, families built something rare, independence, but two city planners studying. Maps in lower Manhattan offices, the land appeared differently. They saw potential, they saw acreage, they saw open space waiting to be shaped into promenades and carriage drives. By early 1856, the machinery of eminent domain was already turning. Eminent domain, the government's legal authority to seize private land for public use, was invoked to secure the park site. Survey lines cut through fields, appraisers calculated value, compensation would be offered, awards would be distributed, legality would be satisfied. But legality does not soften loss. Families received formal notices, documents informing them that their land would be taken. Meetings were held in churches and homes. Questions filled rooms heavy with uncertainty. Where would they go? Would compensation truly reflect what had been built? Could money replace community? Some residents contested the valuations. Others fought quietly, but the decision had already hardened at higher levels of power. The city called it progress, residents called it home. Gravestones would be relocated, structures dismantled, fences torn down, hills reshaped. By the time the park's construction began in earnest, Seneca Village would exist mostly in memory and later in rediscovered foundations beneath the soil. The land was not empty, it was cleared, and that distinction would echo long after trees replaced houses and carriage paths replaced gardens. Because every great city project leaves something beneath it, even if history takes generations to look down and remember. February 1856. The gavel falls in February 1856. The decision that had been building quietly in offices and courtrooms finally crystallized. The New York State Supreme Court approved the assessor's report on the land designated for what would become Central Park. On paper, it read like procedure. A report filed, evaluation confirmed, authority granted. The property within the approved boundaries stretching from 59th to 106th Streets now legally belonged to the city of New York. Routine, administrative, final. But for those living on that land, families in places like Seneca Village, the approval was not bureaucratic. It was a rupture. It was the point of no return. Imagine not standing in a grand courtroom to hear the ruling. Imagine instead a neighbor running down a dirt path, breathless, waving a folded newspaper. It's done. No gavel echoing in marble halls, just whined across rocky ground. Some families accepted compensation and began packing what they could carry. Furniture loaded onto wagons, doors removed from hinges, fences dismantled board by board. Others delayed, clinging to the hope that implementation might stall, that perhaps the city would reconsider, that perhaps the park's grand vision might shrink. Some refused to believe eviction would truly arrive. Because how could a city remove an entire community for grass and trees? How could churches, schools, and graves be erased for landscape? But this wasn't about grass, not yet. It was about authority, about a city flexing its legal power in the name of public good. Eminent domain had been invoked, compensation assessed, legality satisfied. The machinery of progress moved forward with documents and signatures, not apologies. The language was orderly, the impact was not. Communities that had built stability, especially black property-owning families whose land signified political voice in mid-19th century New York, were being displaced in the name of a future that did not include them. The February approval did not plant trees. It cleared people, and once that gavel fell, there was no mechanism. To reverse it, Manhattan's rocky spine would be reshaped. Homes would become pathways, fields would become lawns, but beneath the future promenades and carriage drives, something else would remain. The memory of a community that had once stood there quiet, rooted, and suddenly declared expendable. The city called it progress. History would later call it complicated. But in February 1856, it was simple. The land was no longer theirs. And the transformation of New York had begun. May 21, 1856, regulation and control on May 21, 1856. Another quiet line was written into history. The New York Common Council approved an ordinance for the regulation and government of the Central Park. The words appear harmless, administrative, routine, the sort of language that drifts unnoticed through municipal archives, but language shapes reality. And the phrase regulation and government carried weight far heavier than its tone, because this meant something unmistakable. The park would be controlled from its conception, before trees were planted, before pathways were carved, before a single bench was placed. There would be rules, authority would precede artistry. This was not a spontaneous civic meadow, not a loose experiment in public leisure. It was a state-directed vision, structured, codified, supervised. The ordinance established governance frameworks, commissioners, oversight, jurisdiction, enforcement. It clarified who would decide, what belonged inside the boundaries and who did not. In essence, the park was becoming an institution before it became a landscape, and institutions do not grow wild. They are engineered. By 1856, Manhattan was already a battleground of class tension and rapid expansion. The wealthy pushed northward, escaping the density of lower Manhattan. Immigrants crowded tenements downtown. Disease spread in stagnant summers. Public order was fragile. Public image mattered. Central Park was being conceived not just as greenery but as civic discipline, a space designed to elevate public behavior, to cultivate refinement, to project prestige. Regulation meant more than maintenance. It meant intention. Carriage drives would be separate from pedestrian paths. Class interaction would be choreographed by design. Activity would be structured to reflect a certain vision of civilization. The city was not merely planting trees, it was drafting a future, and that future would not negotiate with those already displaced by its footprint. By May 1856, the legal framework had locked into place. The land had been claimed. Governance had been defined. Oversight had been authorized. What remained was transformation. Rock would be blasted, swamps drained, hills reshaped, communities erased. The ordinance reads like paperwork, but it marked a turning point, because once regulation arrives before creation, the outcome is no longer organic. It is inevitable. Central Park was not emerging accidentally. It was being commanded into existence. And from that moment forward, Manhattan's heart would be redesigned not by chance, but by decree. June 1856, selling the dream. By June 1856, the legal machinery was in motion. The land had been claimed, the ordinance had been passed, authority had been secured. Now came something just as important, belief. Mayor Fernando Wood understood a truth that every ambitious civic project eventually confronts. Power can authorize construction, but public confidence sustains it. The park could not be seen merely as seizure. It had to be seen as vision. It had to feel inevitable, enlightened, almost moral. So Wood moved strategically. In June 1856, he He appointed a consulting board composed of respected and recognizable figures, men whose reputations would soften skepticism and elevate the projects. Image at its head stood Washington Irving. Irving was not an engineer, not a surveyor, not a land commissioner. He was something more powerful in that moment, a symbol, America's literary elder, the author of Rip Van Winkle and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, a figure associated with national identity, culture, and refinement. The message was unmistakable. If Washington Irving stood behind the park, then the park must be noble. It must be civilized. It must be worthy. The symbolism was deliberate and precise. Central Park was being reframed not as a disruption but as cultural destiny, not as displacement but as elevation. Newspapers began to steady their tone. Editorials that once questioned cost or feasibility softened into discussions of grandeur and civic pride. Investors nodded approvingly. Property owners north of 59th Street began imagining increased land values. Elites envisioned carriage promenades beneath canopies of trees not yet planted. The dream was being sold. Images circulated of broad lawns and winding drives, of a Manhattan that could rival the boulevards of Paris and the parks of London, of a city no longer gasping between tenements, but breathing expansively at its core. But credibility does not erase displacement, it reframes it. The presence of respected names did not return land to families removed under eminent domain. It did not restore homes dismantled for survey lines. It did not quiet the grief of communities like Seneca Village. Instead, it layered the project with prestige, and prestige is persuasive. By aligning the park with cultural authority, Mayor Wood transformed it from a contested land acquisition into a moral aspiration. The conversation shifted from "should this happen?" to "how magnificent will it be?" Public imagination began to outrun public memory. By the end of June 1856, Central Park was no longer simply an engineering plan. It was a promise of dignity, a promise of civilization, a promise that New York would not remain a chaotic port but ascend into something grander. And once a city believes in a promise, it becomes very difficult to question the cost. The surveyor entered the engineer, Egbert Ludovicus Viel. In 1856, Viel was tasked with conducting a full topographical survey of the land designated for what would become Central Park. It sounds technical, neutral, necessary, but surveying is never neutral. It is an act of quiet conquest. Viel and his team moved across the rocky terrain with chains, compasses, leveling instruments, and notebooks. They measured hills that rose sharply from Manhattan schist. They mapped swamps that pooled in low ground. They marked elevations, charted watercourses, cataloged outcrops of stubborn stone. They translated landscape into data. Every incline received a number, every depression, a notation, every boulder, a mark, but every measurement carried an unspoken implication. This will change. Where residents saw familiar ground, Viel saw variables. Where children saw open fields, he saw gradients. Where families saw home, he saw terrain. Homes were sketched not as dwellings but as obstructions within plotted boundaries. Gardens became contour lines. Churches became reference points for triangulation. Cemeteries were noted for relocation. The land was being converted from lived space into abstract geometry, and geometry does not feel. On paper, the transformation seemed almost elegant. Curves replaced irregularity. Lines replaced memory. The natural chaos of Manhattan's Upper Island, its ridges, its marshes, its stubborn rock became a series of measured problems awaiting solution. Surveying is powerful precisely because it is quiet. There are no explosions, no speeches, no public ceremonies, just instruments clicking into place, just ink drying on maps. But once a place is mapped, it becomes malleable. Viel's survey would later influence the competition for the park's design. It established what could be reshaped, what would need blasting, what might be preserved. It turned unpredictability into manageable form. It also made displacement irreversible, because once land is reduced to numbers, its emotional weight becomes invisible to planners. A house can be erased with a line. A community can vanish beneath shading. The survey did not plant trees. It prepared the ground for transformation. And by the end of 1856, Manhattan's wild northern spine, once rocky, uneven, human, had been captured on paper, measured, translated, conquered in silence. The silent countdown. By late 1856, the architecture of inevitability was already standing, not in stone, but in structure. Legal ownership secured, governance established, public confidence managed, land precisely measured. Every administrative pillar had been set into place for what would become Central Park, and yet no final design had been chosen. The famous competition that would ultimately select the Greensward Plan by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux would not conclude until 1858, 2 years later. Think about that. Residents were being displaced before the dream even had a final shape. The city had committed to transformation without yet knowing precisely what it would build. The land was taken, communities were uprooted, governance frameworks were installed, but the aesthetic vision, the winding paths, the pastoral meadows, the lakes that would feel natural but were engineered, remained undecided. The park existed first as authority, beauty came later. This is the silent tension of 1856. The displacement was concrete, the design was abstract. Families packed belongings not because a completed landscape required space, but because power required land. The idea of the park had already hardened into law long before its artistic form emerged. In that gap between seizure and design lies the quiet countdown. Surveyors walked ground that would soon be blasted and reshaped. Commissioners discussed prestige and public good. Newspapers reassured readers that New York was ascending toward civilization. But on the rocky hills between 59th and 106th Streets, uncertainty lingered. What exactly would replace these homes? What would justify the sacrifice? No one yet knew. No one yet knew. When the Greensward Plan was finally chosen in 1858, it would introduce a revolutionary vision: separate circulation paths for carriages, riders, and pedestrians. Pastoral vistas carefully composed to appear untouched. Landscapes engineered to feel eternal. But in 1856, that elegance did not yet exist. There was only inevitability. A city determined to breathe, a government determined to command, a future already decided before it had been drawn. The silent countdown was not about trees. It was about timing. It was about timing. By the time beauty arrived, the land would already be empty. And once emptied, it would never return to what it had been, the park we know today began not with lawns but with authority. Night before erasure, imagine a late autumn evening in 1856. Family in Seneca Village sits by lamplight. They have heard the rumors, they have seen the surveyors, they know the city owns the land now. But tonight their home still stands. A child sleeps upstairs, a kettle boils. Outside, Manhattan stretches southward in gaslight glow. They cannot see the future lawns. They cannot imagine joggers or symphonies or ice skaters. They only know this: time is thinning. History often celebrates what replaces. It rarely mourns what it removes. The city's calculation for New York's leaders: the park was not cruelty, it was investment. Property values around the park would soar. Public health would improve. The city's reputation would rise among global capitals. In their minds, the sacrifice of a few hundred residents justified the glory of millions yet unborn. It was arithmetic, and arithmetic rarely pauses for sentiment. Epilogue 1856. The year of decision. Construction would begin in 1857. By the late 1850s, the remaining residents within the park's boundaries would be evicted. Rocks would be blasted from Manhattan's stubborn spine. Swamps would be drained and reshaped into lakes. Millions of cubic yards of soil would be moved, redirected, engineered into something that looked natural but was anything but accidental. The design competition would conclude in 1858, selecting the greensward plan by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, a vision of pastoral beauty carefully composed within the rigid grid of New York City. But 1856 remains the true turning point, because that was the year the city stopped debating and started deciding. The year authority outweighed attachment. The year eminent domain became action instead of theory. The year survey stakes replaced fence posts. The year Central Park became inevitable. By the time trees were planted and carriage drives curved elegantly through meadows, the hardest choices had already been made. The February court approval, the May ordinance of regulation and governance, the June appointments to sell the dream, the quiet calculations of Egbert Veal's survey maps. In 1856, the future did not bloom, it was imposed. Today, when sunlight filters through the trees of Central Park and violin notes drift over the lawn, the park feels timeless. Children run where hills once stood raw and jagged. Couples sit where rock was once blasted apart. Visitors stroll where kitchens once held family dinners. Few remember the survey stakes hammered into earth that once held kitchen tables. Few recall the February ruling, the May ordinance, the June appointments, the meetings behind closed doors. But the park remembers. Beneath its grass lies memory layered beneath soil moved by human will. Beneath the sheep meadow and the ramble lie foundations, gardens, stones once claimed as home. Beneath the curated serenity rests the echo of displacement. Central Park is a masterpiece. It is civic vision realized. It is artistry and engineering intertwined. But in 1856 it was a question: how much must a city erase to become beautiful?
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like and share.